The air inside the small stone chapel felt heavy, not just with the scent of lilies and floor wax, but with a silence so thick it made Arthur's ears ring. He sat on the very edge of the front wooden pew, his hands resting heavily on his knees. His suit, which he hadn't worn in nearly a decade, felt tight across his shoulders. A physical reminder of how much time had passed and how much had changed. He didn't look at the priest. He didn't look at the rows of neighbors and distant cousins behind him. His eyes were fixed entirely on the polished mahogany box resting on the dais. Inside that box was Martha. It was a thought his brain kept rejecting, bouncing away from the reality like a drop of water on a hot skillet. To him, Martha was the smell of sourdough starter and the sound of a humming radiator. She was the person who always reminded him where he'd left his glasses, and the only person in the world who knew he secretly liked trashy detective novels. The priest's voice was a rhythmic drone, a steady tide of words like grace, memory, and peace. Arthur found himself latching onto the word peace. Had she been at peace? The last few months had been a blur of beige hospital curtains and the rhythmic wheezing of a ventilator. He'd spent so many nights sleeping in a plastic chair that his spine felt permanently curved. Through it all, Martha had been quiet. Even when she was conscious, she had become a spectator to her own fading life. A fly landed on the lid of the coffin, its iridescent wings twitching. Arthur watched it with an intensity that bordered on madness. He envied the fly. It could land there, walk across the wood, and fly away. He was stuck. He was rooted to the spot by a grief that felt like lead in his veins as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. A single beam of afternoon light pierced through the high, narrow window of the chapel. It was a sharp, golden needle of light that cut through the gloom and landed directly on the side of the coffin, right near the silver handle on the left. Arthur blinked. He leaned forward just an inch, his joints protesting with a dull ache. At first, he thought it was a scratch from transport. Maybe the pallbearers had bumped it against the doorframe, or perhaps a tool had slipped during the polishing. But as the light hit the wood at just the right angle, the scratch took on a deliberate shape. It wasn't a random scuff. There were 4 vertical lines, followed by a diagonal one slashing through them. A tally. Arthur's breath hitched. He knew that wood. He had picked it out himself, insisting on the finest grain, the smoothest finish. He had inspected the coffin when it arrived at the funeral home 2 days ago, and it had been flawless. It had been a pristine, silent vessel for his wife. Now there were marks. He looked around the room. The priest was still speaking, his eyes closed in prayer. The mourners had their heads bowed. No one was looking where he was looking. Arthur felt a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline, the kind of cold heat that makes your fingers tremble. He leaned closer, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. There wasn't just one group of tally marks. As he squinted, he saw more. They were small, no larger than a fingernail, etched with something sharp and precise. It looked as though someone had taken a needle or a very fine blade and carved into the expensive lacquer. 1 group. 2. 3. His mind began to race, pulling up memories he hadn't thought of in years. Martha had a habit of keeping tallies. She kept them on the inside of the pantry door for the jars of jam she made. She kept them on the back of the calendar to track the days until Arthur came home from his long shifts at the factory when they were young. It was her way of making the world feel orderly. It was her way of counting down or counting up. But who could have done this? Martha had been gone for 3 days. The coffin had been closed since the wake ended last night. Arthur felt a bead of sweat roll down the back of his neck. He looked at the marks again. Under the final set of lines, there was a word. It was tiny, the letters cramped and shaky, as if written by a hand that was losing its strength. Forgive. The word hit Arthur like a physical blow to the stomach. The air in the chapel suddenly felt too thin to breathe. He looked at the mahogany lid, and for the first time in 40 years, he felt like he was looking at a stranger. Who was the woman in that box? He thought he knew every corner of her soul. He thought their lives were 2 threads woven so tightly together that you couldn't pull one without unraveling the other. But those marks were a message, and they weren't meant for the priest or the neighbors or the cousins. They were meant for him. Or perhaps they were meant of him. As the priest signaled for the congregation to stand for the final blessing, Arthur stayed seated for a second too long. His eyes were locked on that word, forgive. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was his old friend, Thomas. "It's time, Art," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with sympathy. "Time to say goodbye." Arthur stood up, but his legs felt like they belonged to someone else. As he began to follow the coffin out toward the waiting hearse, he didn't feel the closure he had been promised. He felt a cold, gnawing dread. The simple life he thought they had shared was suddenly full of shadows. The truth was hidden right under his fingertips. Etched in wood and bone, the cemetery was a sea of gray stones and damp grass. The rain hadn't started yet, but the sky was the color of a bruised plum, hanging low over the mourners. Arthur stood by the open grave, his coat collar turned up against a wind that seemed to blow right through his bones. He watched as the pallbearers lowered the coffin with practiced mechanical movements. Every inch it sank into the earth felt like a door closing on his own life. His mind was stuck on those marks. 12 lines. Why 12? And that word forgive. It played on a loop in his head like a broken record. He looked at the people gathered around him. There were the neighbors from down the street, the baker who always gave Martha an extra roll, and the librarian who knew her favorite mystery authors. They all looked sad, but it was a normal kind of sadness. None of them looked like they were hiding a secret that needed carving into a coffin lid, as the priest began the final prayers. Arthur's eyes wandered to the edge of the woods that bordered the cemetery. Standing under the skeletal branches of an old oak tree was a man. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a heavy, waxed canvas coat that looked like it had seen decades of hard work. He wasn't holding an umbrella or a prayer book. He was just standing there, perfectly still, watching the coffin go down. Arthur didn't recognize him. In a town this small, you usually knew everyone, or at least you knew who their parents were. This man was a ghost. When the priest said amen, and the first shovel of dirt hit the mahogany with a hollow thud, Arthur saw the stranger flinch. The man reached into his pocket, pulled out a small white handkerchief, and pressed it to his eyes for a brief second. Then, as if sensing Arthur's gaze, he turned and began to walk away toward the iron gates. "Art, you okay?" Thomas asked, stepping closer. Arthur didn't answer. He couldn't. He broke away from the group, ignoring the confused whispers of his friends. He started walking, then jogging, his dress shoes slipping on the wet grass. He had to know who that man was. He had to know if the man knew about the tally marks. "Wait," Arthur called out, his voice sounding thin and raspy in the cold air. The stranger didn't stop. He moved with a surprising quickness for someone who looked to be in his 60s. By the time Arthur reached the cemetery gates, the man was already climbing into an old rusted blue pickup truck parked on the shoulder of the road. "Please, wait." Arthur shouted again, reaching the side of the truck just as the engine roared to life. The man paused. He looked at Arthur through the glass. His face was a map of deep lines and sun-damaged skin, but his eyes were what struck Arthur. They were filled with a profound, heavy guilt. The stranger rolled down the window just a few inches. The smell of cedar wood and old tobacco drifted out. "I shouldn't have come," the man whispered. His voice was like gravel rubbing together. "Did you do it?" Arthur gasped, trying to catch his breath. "The marks on the wood? The word. Did you put them there?" The man's grip tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "I only did what she asked, Mr. Henderson. She came to my shop 3 months ago. She paid for the best wood I had, but she had conditions. She said the truth had to be carried with her, but it had to be seen by you first." Arthur felt the world tilt. What truth? Martha didn't have secrets. We were married for 40 years. The man looked away, staring through the windshield at the rain that was finally starting to fall. Sometimes we keep secrets not because we want to lie, but because we want to protect the people we love from a ghost they didn't know was haunting them. She told me you were a good man. She said you'd spent your whole life trying to fix a hole your father left behind. Arthur froze. His father had been a charismatic man, but he was a gambler and a cheat. He had run a development scheme in the late 70s that had wiped out the savings of half the town before he disappeared, leaving Arthur to spend his youth apologizing and working 3 jobs just to clear the family name. Arthur thought that chapter was closed. He thought the debt was paid. "She told me to give you this if you followed me," the stranger said. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, weathered leather notebook. He slid it through the gap in the window. There are 12 names in there. Each name has a number next to it. She spent every penny of her secret savings, the money her aunt left her to find the families your father ruined. Arthur took the notebook with trembling hands. "Why? Why wouldn't she tell me?" "Because she knew you'd stop her," the man said, shifting the truck into gear. "She knew you'd say it wasn't her responsibility. But she couldn't stand seeing you carry that weight anymore. She wanted the tally to be finished. 12 families. 12 payments. The last mark was for the last person on that list." The truck began to pull away, leaving Arthur standing in the rain. He opened the notebook. The pages were filled with Martha's neat, looped handwriting. He flipped to the very back page, and his heart stopped. The 12th name wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a victim of his father's scams. The 12th name was his own. The rain didn't just fall. It wept. It soaked through Arthur's thin dress shirt, making the fabric cling to his skin like a cold second layer. He stood by the side of the road, the rusted blue truck long gone, holding the small leather notebook against his chest as if it were a living thing. The wind whipped the pages, and for a moment, he was afraid the ink Martha's ink would wash away before he could understand it. He walked back to his car, his movements slow and heavy. He didn't go back to the grave to join the others for the wake at the community hall. He couldn't face the polite smiles and the casseroles. He drove home in total silence, the windshield wipers clicking back and forth, counting the seconds of his new, confusing reality. When he entered the house, the silence was different than it had been that morning. It wasn't the silence of an empty house. It was the silence of a house full of secrets. He sat down at the small kitchen table, the one he and Martha had shared for nearly 15,000 mornings, and laid the notebook on the checkered tablecloth. He opened the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. It was the same script that had written his grocery lists and his birthday cards for decades. But the content was a map of a life he hadn't known she was leading. The first name on the list was Mrs. Gable. Arthur remembered Mrs. Gable. She had lived in a tiny, crumbling house on the edge of town when he was a boy. His father had sold her investment bonds for a shopping center that was never built. When the money vanished, Mrs. Gable had lost everything and ended up working in the school cafeteria well into her 80s. Arthur had always felt a pang of guilt every time he saw her serving mashed potatoes to the kids. Knowing his family's name was the reason, she couldn't retire. Next to Mrs. Gable's name was a date from 5 years ago and a number, $4,200. Below it, short note, paid in full. She cried and thought it was an anonymous government refund. She can finally afford her medicine. Arthur's hand shook. 5 years ago? Martha had been doing this for 5 years. He thought back to that time. They had been planning a trip to the coast for their anniversary, but Martha had suddenly said she didn't feel like traveling. She told him the car needed repairs and that they should save the money instead. Now he realized the car had been fine. She had sent that money to Mrs. Gable. He flipped the page. Name after name appeared. People he grew up with. Families who had moved away in disgrace after losing their farms. Martha had tracked them down. She had spent hours, no years, playing detective. She had found them in nursing homes, in different states, in small apartments. And every time she found one, she sent a cashier's check. But where did the money come from? They weren't wealthy. Arthur had worked at the mill, and Martha had been a part-time seamstress. Then he remembered the inheritance. Martha's Aunt June had passed away years ago and left her a modest sum. Martha told Arthur she had put it into a long-term savings account for their old age. "Our old age is secure, Artie," she would say with a smile whenever he worried about the bills. "Don't you fret about the future." She hadn't been saving for their future. She had been buying back his past. She had been erasing the stains his father had left on the world. One tally mark at a time. Arthur reached the middle of the book. The dates became more recent. The notes became shorter, the handwriting more strained as her illness began to take hold. He saw the name of a man named Silas, whose father had been his own father's best friend and biggest victim. Martha had tracked Silas to a homeless shelter in the city. The note there read, "Sent the final installment." He sounds sober on the phone. He thinks it's a miracle. Maybe it is. Arthur felt a sob catch in his throat. He had spent 40 years trying to be the good man to make up for his father's sins. He had worked extra shifts. He had been honest to a fault. He had never even taken a penny that wasn't his. But while he was busy being honest, Martha was being just. She was doing the hard, invisible work of healing people he had forgotten were even hurting. Then he reached the last page. The 12th tally. The name written there was his own. Arthur. Underneath his name, there was no dollar amount. There was no paid in full note. Instead, there was a folded piece of paper tucked into a tiny pocket in the back of the leather cover. With fumbling fingers, Arthur unfolded it. It wasn't a bank receipt. It was a letter dated only 2 weeks ago, when she was barely able to hold a pen. "My dearest Artie," it began. "If you are reading this, it means the man at the woodshop did his job. Don't be angry with him. I made him swear on his life to give you this book only when the time was right." Arthur's tears hit the paper, blurring the ink. "You always carried the world on your shoulders. Artie, you thought you had to pay for your father's mistakes every single day? I saw it in the way you never bought yourself a new coat. I saw it in the way you apologized for things that weren't your fault. I couldn't let you go to your own grave still feeling like a debtor. I used the money to clear the names. But the 12th mark, that's the one that matters most." Arthur wiped his eyes, trying to read the shaky script. "The 12th mark is for you, Artie. I didn't pay a stranger for this one. I spent these 40 years loving you to show you that you aren't your father. You are the man who stayed. You are the man who cared. The truth I never expected you to see is that you were never the one who owed anything. You were the one who was owed. Forgive yourself, Artie. The tally is finished. The debt is gone. Please, just live." Arthur looked at the empty chair across from him. He saw the sunlight finally breaking through the clouds, hitting the spot where she used to sit. He realized then that the strange sign on the coffin wasn't just a secret she was taking to the grave. It was her final act of love. She had turned her own death into a doorway for him to finally, truly be free. He closed the book and held it to his face. It still smelled faintly of her lavender and old paper. For the first time in his life, the weight in his chest didn't feel like lead. It felt like light. Arthur sat in the dimly lit kitchen. The notebook opened to the third name on the list, the Henderson General Store. It was a place that hadn't existed for 30 years. But as he stared at the name, the memories came rushing back. He began to piece together the how and the when. He realized that while he was working his 10-hour shifts at the mill, Martha wasn't just at home sewing or gardening. She was a woman on a mission, living a double life fueled by a love so quiet he had mistaken it for simple domesticity. He remembered a summer about 8 years ago. It was a Tuesday, a day like any other. He had come home to find Martha at the kitchen table, her eyes red as if she'd been crying. But she had quickly wiped them and pointed toward a fresh peach cobbler on the counter. "Just the heat, Artie," she'd said. "The oven makes the kitchen a bit much today." Now, reading the entry for that date in the notebook, he saw the truth. That morning, Martha had taken a 2-hour bus ride to the next county. She had gone to visit an elderly man named Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson's father had been the owner of that general store. And when Arthur's father had skipped town with the investment money, the store had gone bankrupt. The family had been disgraced, forced to move into a tiny apartment above a garage in the notebook. Martha described the encounter in simple, heartbreaking words. She wrote about finding Mr. Thompson sitting on a porch in a tattered cardigan. She didn't tell him she was the daughter-in-law of the man who ruined him. She told him she was a representative of a private restitution fund. She had handed him an envelope containing $5,000 money she had saved by skipping lunches, by mending her own shoes instead of buying new ones, and by using the small inheritance from her aunt, Arthur leaned back in his chair, the wooden legs creaking. He felt a wave of shame wash over him. He thought of all the times he'd complained about the price of gas, or the fact they hadn't bought a new television in 15 years. Martha would just nod and say, "We have everything we need. Artie, we have our health, and we have each other." They never realized she was literally giving away their extra life to buy back his honor. He turned the page and found another entry. This one was from the year he had been laid off for 3 months. Money had been tight, so tight they were eating beans and toast most nights. Yet, in the notebook, there was a record of a payment made to a woman named Clara. Clara's family had lost their farm because of a fraudulent land deed Arthur's father had forged. Martha had sent Clara $300 that month. It was exactly the amount Arthur had received from his small severance pay, which he thought had gone toward the electric bill. Martha had told him the utility company had made an error and given them a credit. She hadn't lied to be cruel. She had lied to be a shield. She didn't want him to feel the weight of the debt, so she took it upon herself to pay it in secret. As Arthur read on, he realized the strange sign on the coffin. Those tally marks were her way of keeping herself accountable. Every time she reached a goal, every time she found a person and made things right, she mentally added a mark to her heart. The woodworker had simply made those invisible marks visible for Arthur to see. He pictured her in her final months, her body weakening, but her spirit burning with a singular focus. She had been racing against time. She knew she was dying, and she knew there were still names left on the list. The tally marks weren't just a record of payments. They were the heartbeat of a woman who refused to leave her husband with a legacy of shame. In the notebook, she wrote, "I see the way Artie looks at the old neighbors. He thinks they see his father when they look at him. I want him to look in the mirror and see only himself. I want him to know that the world doesn't hate the name Henderson anymore. I've made sure of it." Arthur stood up and walked to the window. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. He looked at his own reflection in the glass. For the first time in his life, he didn't see the shadow of the man who had run away. He saw a man who had been loved by a saint. He saw a man whose life had been quietly redeemed by a woman who never asked for a thank you. He realized that the truth he never expected wasn't just about the money or the scams. It was the realization that he had lived alongside a hero for 40 years and hadn't truly seen her until she was gone. The marks on the coffin were a map, and they were leading him toward a life where he didn't have to be afraid of his own shadow anymore. But then, noticed something at the bottom of the page. A small note written in a different, hurried hand. It was a phone number and a name he didn't recognize, Julian. This must be the craftsman, the man in the blue truck. Under the number, Martha had written, "If the 12 marks aren't enough, ask Julian about the box beneath the floorboards in the shed." Arthur's heart skipped a beat. There was more. The story wasn't finished. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the night air smelling of damp earth and pine needles. Arthur took an old flashlight from the kitchen drawer and headed out to the backyard. His boots crunched on the gravel path leading to the small wooden shed where he kept his lawnmower and garden tools. For years, this had been his sanctuary, a place to fix broken things. But now he realized it held one last secret from the woman who had spent her life fixing his past. Inside the shed, the air was cool and smelled of sawdust. He moved a stack of empty flower pots and a rusted bag of fertilizer to find the corner Martha had mentioned in her note. He knelt on the dusty floor, his knees cracking. He pulled back a piece of old frayed rug, and there it was, a single floorboard that looked slightly looser than the others. He used a flathead screwdriver to pry the board up. Tucked into the dark space between the joists was a small tin box, rusted at the hinges. Arthur took a deep breath, his heart thumping against his ribs. He sat back on his heels and opened the lid. Inside wasn't more money. There were no more lists of debts or names of people his father had cheated. Instead, the box was filled with dozens of photographs and a small silver locket. Arthur picked up the photos one by one. They weren't of him, and they weren't of Martha. They were photos of children playing in parks, families sitting at Thanksgiving tables, and young couples standing in front of their first homes. On the back of each photo, Martha had written a name and a short sentence. "This is little Tommy. He's the grandson of the woman who lost her bakery. Because of the refund, he's the first in his family to go to college. This is the Miller family. They finally moved back to the county. They have a garden now. Arthur realized that Martha hadn't just been sending checks. She had been following the lives of the people she helped. She had been watching the ripples of her kindness move through the world. She didn't just want to pay back the money. She wanted to see the joy return to the lives that his father had made dark. She had turned a legacy of theft into a legacy of growth. At the bottom of the tin was the silver locket. Arthur opened it with a trembling thumb. Inside was a tiny picture of Arthur himself when he was just 20 years old, looking tired and covered in soot from his shift at the mill. Opposite his picture were 3 words engraved in the metal: "You are enough." The weight that had been sitting on Arthur's chest for 40 years finally dissolved. He realized that the truth he never expected wasn't about his father's crimes or the money Martha spent. The truth was that Martha had never seen him as a man who needed to apologize for being alive. She didn't see him as the son of a crook. She saw him as a hero who had worked himself to the bone to be a good husband. And she had spent her life trying to make him see himself through her eyes. He stood up, clutching the tin box to his chest. He walked out of the shed and looked up at the moon, which was finally peeking through the clouds. The tally on the coffin was finished. The marks were in the wood, and the wood was in the earth, and the debt was buried forever. He walked back into the house. And for the first time since the funeral, the rooms didn't feel empty. They felt full of her presence. He sat at the kitchen table and picked up the phone. He dialed the number for Julian, the woodworker. The phone rang 3 times before a gravelly voice answered. "Hello?" "Julian," Arthur said, his voice steady and clear. "This is Arthur. I found the box. I found everything." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Arthur heard a soft sigh of relief. "She told me you'd find it when you were ready to stop being sorry, Mr. Henderson." "I am," Arthur said. "I'm ready. But I want to do one more thing. I want to come to your shop. I want to learn how to work with wood. I want to learn how to build things that last, just like she did." "I think she'd like that," Julian replied. "I'll see you Monday morning, Arthur." Arthur hung up the phone. He looked at the notebook one last time before closing it. He knew the road ahead would be lonely without her, but he wasn't walking in shadows anymore. He was a man who had been forgiven, not by the world, but by the person who knew him best. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, sleeping deeply for the first time in years. The tally was closed. The story was done. And for Arthur, life was finally beginning. The Monday morning air was crisp and carried the sharp scent of pine needles and damp earth. Arthur stood at the end of his driveway, his old car idling in the cold. For the first time in 40 years, he wasn't driving to the mill. He wasn't going to a job that felt like a life sentence. He was wearing his old work trousers and a flannel shirt that Martha had patched so many times. The elbows were more thread than original fabric. He felt a strange flutter in his stomach, not the heavy dread he was used to, but a nervous excitement that felt almost like being young again. He drove across the county, passing fields where the frost still clung to the stalks of dead corn. He found the wood shop tucked away at the end of a long gravel lane. It was a sturdy building made of cedar planks, with smoke curling lazily from a stone chimney. Julian was already there, standing in the doorway with a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. The blue truck from the cemetery was parked to the side, looking even more weathered in the daylight. "You're early," Julian said, stepping aside to let Arthur into the warmth. The inside of the shop was a sanctuary. Every wall was lined with tools, chisels, saws, planes, and clamps, all organized with a precision that reminded Arthur of Martha's notebook. The air was thick with the sweet, dusty smell of sawdust and beeswax. In the center of the room sat a massive workbench made of solid oak, scarred by years of labor. "I didn't want to keep the wood waiting," Arthur joked. Though his voice was a bit shaky, Julian didn't laugh. But a small, kind smile touched his eyes. "Wood doesn't like to wait. That's true. But it also doesn't like to be rushed. That was the first thing your wife learned when she came here." Arthur paused, his hand resting on a piece of raw timber. "She came here. She actually worked here?" "Not at the bench," Julian clarified. She sat right where you're standing. She wanted to know exactly what kind of wood would last 100 years in the ground. She wanted to know the soul of the mahogany. She told me she was preparing a vessel for a secret, and she needed it to be strong enough to hold the weight of a lifetime. Julian walked over to a stack of walnut boards. She paid me for the coffin, yes. But she also paid me to teach you if you ever showed up. She said you had builder's hands that had been forced to do breaker's work for too long. She wanted you to create something that wasn't for debt or for duty, but just for the sake of making something beautiful. For the next few hours, Julian didn't give Arthur a saw or a hammer. Instead, he handed him a piece of sandpaper and a rough block of cherry wood. "Feel the grain," Julian commanded. "Close your eyes and tell me where the tree wanted to grow." It sounded like nonsense at first, but as Arthur rubbed the wood, he felt the ridges and the valleys of the fiber. He felt the history of the tree, the years of rain, the years of drought, the scars where branches had fallen off. He realized that wood was a lot like people. It carried everything that had ever happened to it, but with enough patience and care, you could smooth out the rough edges and find the glow underneath. As he worked, the door to the shop creaked open. A young woman stepped in, shivering against the wind. She looked to be in her 20s, with a tired expression and a coat that was far too thin for a December morning. She held a small wooden box in her hands. The hinges were broken, and the lid was hanging by a sliver of metal. "Mr. Julian," she asked softly, "you fixed my grandfather's chair last year. He passed away last month, and I found this in his closet. It's the box where he kept his letters. I can't afford much, but I was wondering if it could be saved." Julian looked at Arthur, then back at the girl. He didn't move toward her. Instead, he nodded toward Arthur. "Ask him. He's the new man on the bench today." Arthur's heart hammered. "Oh, I'm just a student. I don't know if I can look at the box, Arthur." Julian interrupted. Arthur wiped his dusty hands on his trousers and walked over. He took the small box from the girl. As soon as he touched it, he froze. He knew this box. He recognized the craftsmanship. It was a simple, sturdy design, but there was a signature burned into the bottom corner. A signature he hadn't seen in decades. It was his father's mark. A small, stylized H. His father hadn't just been a thief. Before he had lost his mind to greed, he had been a carpenter. He had built things for people in this town before he started stealing from them. The girl noticed his expression. "Is something wrong?" Arthur looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the faint resemblance to a family name in the notebook. She was a Thompson, the great-granddaughter of the man who had lost the general store. The debt Martha had paid was to this girl's family. "Nothing is wrong," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at the broken hinges and the scarred wood. He saw the history of his father's hands, and he saw the opportunity for his own. "I can fix this. And there will be no charge." "I can't ask you to do that," the girl protested. "You aren't asking," Arthur said, a sense of peace washing over him that was stronger than anything he had ever felt. "I'm offering. This box belongs to my family's history as much as it belongs to yours. It's time it was made whole again." For the rest of the day, Arthur didn't think about the tally marks or the coffin or the rain. He focused on the tiny screws, the delicate wood glue, and the scent of the cherry wood. He worked with a focus that made the hours disappear. By the time the sun began to set, the box was beautiful. The lid fit perfectly. The wood shone as the girl left, clutching the box to her chest with a bright, tearful smile. Julian walked over and put a heavy hand on Arthur's shoulder. "You see, Arthur," Julian said, "the tally marks on the coffin weren't just about the people she paid back. They were about the person you were going to become once the debt was gone. She didn't just save them. She saved you." Arthur looked at his hands. They were covered in dust and stained with oil, but for the first time in his life, they didn't feel heavy. They felt light. They felt like they were finally ready to build something new. He looked out the window at the evening stars, knowing that somewhere Martha was watching, and finally the count was 0. He was free. The winter sun was pale and cold as Arthur drove through the center of town. In the passenger seat sat his newfound toolkit, a gift from Julian. After years of avoiding certain streets and keeping his head down in the local grocery store. Arthur felt a strange, quiet courage. The notebook was still in his pocket, but he didn't need to look at the names anymore. He had memorized them. They weren't just names of victims anymore. They were neighbors he had ignored out of a sense of misplaced shame. He pulled up in front of a small, lopsided house on the corner of Elm Street. This was the home of Mr. Henderson, no relation, though the shared name had always made the situation more awkward. The elder Mr. Henderson was a man who had lost his small trucking business because of a bad contract Arthur's father had tricked him into signing 40 years ago. Now, the old man lived alone. His porch was sagging so badly that the front door wouldn't even shut properly. Arthur stepped out of the car, feeling the bite of the wind. He grabbed his level and a box of long, heavy-duty screws. As he walked up the path, he saw the curtain in the front window twitch. A moment later, the door creaked open just a crack. A raspy voice called out. Arthur stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm here to fix the railing and the joists, Mr. Henderson. My name is Arthur. My father was the man who—" He trailed off, the words sticking in his throat for a second before he pushed them out. "My father was the man who hurt your business. I can't fix the past, but I can fix this porch." There was a long, heavy silence. The old man leaned out, his face a map of white stubble and deep-set wrinkles. He looked at Arthur's hands, then at the tools. "I didn't ask for charity," the old man spat, though his voice lacked any real venom. It sounded more like a habit of being guarded. "It's not charity," Arthur said softly, stepping onto the first creaking board. "It's a debt I'm paying. Not to you, but to my wife. She started this work, and I'm just finishing the last few marks." The old man watched him for nearly an hour as Arthur worked. Arthur didn't talk much. He focused on the wood. He crawled under the porch, his back pressing against the cold, damp earth as he hammered in new support beams. He felt the sweat despite the cold air. Every strike of the hammer felt like he was driving a nail into the coffin of his own guilt. Around noon, the front door opened fully. The old man came out carrying 2 mugs of steaming tea. He sat on the top step, which was now firm and steady. "Your wife was here, you know," the old man said, staring out at the street. "About a year ago, she brought me a basket of apples and an envelope. She told me it was from a silent partner who wanted to make things right. I knew it was her, though. Nobody else in this town has eyes that kind." Arthur stopped hammering and looked up. He felt a lump in his throat. "She didn't tell me. She said you were a man who worried too much about things you couldn't change," the old man continued. "She said if I ever saw you coming around with a hammer, I should let you work. She said it would be the only way you'd ever learn to stand up straight again." Arthur sat down on the lower step, taking the tea. The heat from the mug seeped into his frozen fingers. "She spent her whole life protecting me from the truth of what she was doing. I thought I was the one taking care of her." "Maybe you were," the old man said. "But sometimes the best way to take care of someone is to give them a reason to be proud of the person they see in the mirror. She knew you wouldn't be proud, as long as you felt like you owed the world something." They sat in silence for a while. 2 men connected by a ghost from 40 years ago, and a woman who had refused to let that ghost win. By the time Arthur finished the porch, the sun was beginning to set. The railing was solid. The door swung shut with a clean, satisfying click. As Arthur packed his tools into the car, the old man called out from the porch, "Hey, Arthur." Arthur turned around. "The porch looks good," the old man said, a small, genuine smile breaking through his stern expression. "Better than it ever did. Tell that father of yours wherever he is that his son is a better man than he ever dreamed of being." Arthur nodded, unable to speak. He got into his car and sat there for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He realized that the truth was still unfolding. It wasn't just about the money Martha had paid back. It was about the community she had rebuilt for him. She had softened the hearts of the people who hated his name, so that when he finally found the courage to show his face, he would be met with tea and conversation instead of slamming doors. He looked at the notebook on the dashboard. There were only a few names left. People who lived further away, people he would have to travel to find. But he wasn't afraid of the road anymore. Every name was a chance to build something. Every name was a way to say thank you to the woman who had seen the man he was beneath, the shame he carried. He drove home. and as he passed the cemetery, he didn't feel the sharp, stabbing pain of loss. He felt a quiet warmth. He whispered a thank you into the darkness of the car, knowing that the tally wasn't just a count of debts, it was a count of new beginnings. And he was only just getting started.